The Sanity App SDK is a collection of utilities, which we're going to see as React hooks, for providing CMS-like behaviors in your own custom content applications. And if you're asking what's a content application, well, we'll define that as a purpose-built application for the creation of content. Most often when you're working with CMSs, you're concerned with front-end applications that query and consume content, but a large enough team will have specific needs that are met better by a purpose-built application than a general-purpose, one-size-fits-no-one CMS. In this course, we build a feedback processing application, a custom interface for racing through comments, marking some as spam, approving or deleting, and leaving some internal notes for anybody else that needs to review them. If you're following this video on YouTube, make sure that you check out sanity.io/learn to see the full code examples of what I'm going to show through the rest of this video. If you're on Sanity Learn, let's click through the next lesson and get started. Before we start building our app, we will need to create a new Sanity project and Sanity Studio. But keep in mind, you don't actually need a Sanity Studio in order to build an app. That's because the content lake has always been decoupled from Sanity Studio, the CMS-like interface that you may be familiar with. It just helps us to have a centralized source of truth to be able to look at our entire content model. That's what Sanity Studio is really great for. And then we can separately build our custom application and watch changes update both applications at the same time. Here I have a blank new folder to work within, and keep in mind that we're going to put our studio and our application side by side, so we should end up with two folders with separate development processes. So here at the root of my feedback folder that I've already created, I'm going to run this command to create a new Sanity Studio and project. You can create a new Sanity project for free at any time. If you don't already have an account, you'll be prompted to create one, and you'll see a few flags in this CLI command that have chosen the blog template, created a new project, and set the dataset name. Now we can go into the studio directory, run npm run dev to start the development server. In your browser, log in with the same account that you used if you logged into the Sanity CLI. So we now have our Sanity Studio with a few custom document types, and we could create content straight away with these shapes. These schema types are defined in code within Sanity Studio. We could have a look at the post type document there. And what we need to do is create a new schema type for feedback. So we can go into the Studio schema types directory, create a new feedback type file, paste in this code example, and then register that to our schemas within this index type. So we can now create feedback type documents with the fields that we've set in that schema. To save you time creating content to be able to test out your application, we've provided a feedback seed file with all of these documents saved as an ND.json file. Place this at the root of your Studio project and run the npx dataset import command to add those to your Studio. Later in this course, you'll start deleting documents, so you can rerun this command if you ever want to add this dummy data once again. So we now have a new Sanity project, Sanity Studio, and some fake content in order to build our application. Let's go and do that in the next lesson. There's another command line script we can run to quick start our application. Just make sure you don't do this in the Studio folder, but go back up to your root directory and run it from there. In this one, you'll need to select your organization, not your project. And so you should now have two folders, one for the Studio and one for your feedback application. I like working with the Sanity UI front-end library for Sanity applications because it keeps harmony with the Studio and other parts of the Sanity ecosystem. If you're more comfortable with something like Radix or Tailwind, we have guides available for those, and you can use whichever front-end framework you like because the Sanity App SDK is headless by design. We need to do a little configuration first before we go any further. Because both the application and the Studio would run on the same development port, we need to go and make an update to the Sanity CLI inside of the Studio. Let's go and add a server port of 3334. And because our browser will need to talk with our project at this origin, we'll need to add a new cause origin for the project as well. So let's go open up the Studio there. And we can run another command line script to add a new cause origin. If you'd ever like to modify project level settings, you can always run npx sanity manage to open up the Sanity management interface in your browser. And from here, we could take a look at the API tab, look at the cause origins, and here's the newest one that we just set. Now I'm going to go back to my Studio process and restart this one, because I want to start it on a new port. So now my studio is running at localhost 3334. And now in another terminal tab, I can open up my app feedback, run npm run dev, and I'll be given a unique URL to be able to run this application within the Sanity dashboard. The Sanity dashboard is a unified interface for all of your applications and studios so that authors can jump between different applications to perform different tasks. There's a little bit of config that we'll need to copy over from our studio as well. So grabbing the dataset name and project ID from the studio's CLI or Sanity config file, we'll go and open up the app file here in our feedback application and paste those details in. You might have noticed a subtle difference between the Sanity Studio config and our application config. The Studio has only ever been able to target a single project ID and dataset at once, where our applications can be designed to target multiple as we've provided an array of configuration objects. Keep this in mind for your future applications, as you can now build more flexibly and across concerns than ever before. Now we're all set up and ready to go, let's start actually querying content. Throughout this course, we're going to build an application that performs queries and mutations only through React hooks. And if you're used to working with Sanity before, you may be more familiar with the Sanity Client, which gives you direct access to all of Sanity's APIs. The big difference is that Sanity App SDK has so much more behavior built into it, things like optimistic updates and caching. So it's a far more convenient way to build rich applications than using the Sanity Client directly, although we do have access to that, and we'll touch that in a later lesson. Let's finally start fetching. In the app feedback folder down here in the source file, I'm going to create a new document here called feedback. This is going to hold the most of the logic of our application, and I'm also going to create another component here called feedback list. Nothing's changed in our application yet because we need to load it. So let's go back to the root app file. And here, instead of the example component, let's load our feedback. We have a feedback component here, which is going to hold the logic of which item of feedback is currently selected. We have a grid with two different columns here. First of all, we have a list of documents, which we're seeing rendered here on the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, we're going to render the editing form. If we have a look at the feedback list component, we can see it's using this hook called useDocuments with just one parameter document type of feedback. So this is where you get a big difference from Sanity Client to fetches with the App SDK. useDocuments is only going to fetch in batches, it's going to have a set order, and it has inbuilt filtering, which we could even extend, and we will do later in the lesson. It gives us convenient methods to render the data, as well as functions to load more if there is more data than the current batch size is showing. And all of these conveniences hidden away inside the useDocument hooks and throughout all the hooks in the SDK mean that our application should remain really fast. And you may notice we're not being returned documents, but rather this object of 4 items, which represents the document. And we call these document handles, and you'll see them throughout the App SDK. Again, if we fetch fewer documents and smaller information about each one, we'll keep our document application really fast. So we are now querying and rendering content, but not the content of each individual document. Let's fix that next. We have document handles for every document we want to render, but we need a component that's going to fetch that document in order to render its value. First of all, let's create a new component that can render the status field in some nice styling. And then a component which is going to take a document handle and fetch certain attributes off of that document. We'll call it feedback preview and paste in the code example there. So this component is using a hook called useDocumentProjection. And so what it takes in is that document handle as the props. It then takes a reference so that it only performs the following query when it is being rendered in the view. And then it runs this grok projection for these fields off of the document. Just a quick note to say there is TypeScript support for App SDK, but it's currently experimental, so I've left it out of this course. It may change in future, but it is documented. If you'd like to try it out now, check out the Sanity docs for more. And then once we've resolved these items off of the document, we can render them into the screen. Let's go back to our feedback list. I'm going to update the entire file here. So instead of those code snippets, we're going to render a button for every item. When we click that button, it'll render which feedback item is selected. Then we've wrapped a suspense boundary around our feedback preview item. And we can see now every one of those documents is getting values fetched off of it, and each one of these documents is being queried individually as they render into the DOM. I can click on any of these to select them, but at present it won't actually do anything. It's probably a good time to talk about suspense because we're going to see a lot of it throughout our application. If you're not familiar with suspense, it's a relatively new concept in React, but it simply means that every one of our components that uses a fetching hook, like useDocuments, like useDocumentProjection, needs to be wrapped in suspense so that that is the boundary in which the loading happens. If we didn't use these suspense boundaries, it would keep going up the tree until it finds one, and that would be the root Sanity app component, and we don't want the whole app to re-render just because a single component is fetching data. There's more information about this on the Sanity documentation and the React docs if you're not clear about suspense. With that, let's move on. So we can select documents on the left, but it's not showing us an editing form on the right. Let's fix that and introduce the hook useDocument. We'll start by creating a new component in this source file here called feedback edit. We've created this feedback edit component. It's using the useDocument hook from the React SDK. And once again, we're just passing in this document handle. Now we can go back to the feedback application and introduce our feedback edit component, which we'll need to import as well. And actually what I'm going to do there, because AI hasn't helped me, I need to render it conditionally. Only if there's selected feedback, then do I render the feedback editing form. And of course I need to wrap this in a suspense boundary as well, so that the loading state doesn't occur further up the tree. You can now see that we can select items on the left-hand side, and it'll load the selected document on the right. We do get that loading spinner in between. And you might be asking, what's the difference between useDocument and useDocumentProjection if they're both just querying values off of a document? useDocument maintains a more real-time, up-to-date, in-memory version of that document. So this is where our optimistic edits happen, where useDocumentProjection will be updated in real time, but only as a response from the content lake. Because useDocument can be more memory intensive, we want to limit the amount of times that we use it in our application. So we're using it for the faster optimistic updates in the editing form, where we're leaving the document list to be that more eventually correct real-time update. So far, all we've done is still just query content. Let's finally start making some edits with the useEditDocument hook. Once again, I'll make another component here. This one's going to be called sentiment. And if we have a look at the code here, we'll see once again, we're spreading in one of these document handles, and then we give our useEditDocument hook a path. And what this will do is return us a function that when we pass it a value, it will edit the document at that path in the document with the updated value. And so in this particular component, I've got a few different options here for the sentiments. I'm going to map over those and just render out a radio button. So as we select the different radio buttons, it will edit the sentiment value in the document. To watch this work, let's go back to our feedback edit file. And I've got a comment here for where to put these. And let's drop sentiment in there. And now I can start making changes straight away. And because this is being written directly to the content lake, that means I can give the page a hard reload and still see those values saved. It also means that if we were to bring up the Sanity Studio on the left-hand side and our custom application on the right, we'll see that as we make changes on the right, that content change is being written to the content lake. And this is the magic of creating content applications. You haven't vibe coded some siloed off application with its own unique database. You are working with the central source of truth, your content lake, but building a custom content editing experience. Better yet, the Sanity App SDK handles logic in cases where this is a published version of the document, but if I go and make an edit to that document, what will be invoked is a brand new draft, which would need to be published before that change is seen live everywhere. I'm going to make another component here called notes. We can see here this one has a text area, and its configuration for useEditDocument will write to the path of notes on a document. And if I go back to the feedback edit component here, we can drop in the notes component. And so now we can make some changes. And actually, this one's quite positive. Hopefully you see now that the Sanity App SDK is the most powerful way to create content applications. But at the moment, all we're doing is authoring new drafts. We need a way to take actions on documents like publish and delete. Let's start looking at that in the next lesson. Let's update our application so that it can take actions on entire documents. We'll create a new component once again. This one we'll call actions.tsx. And paste in the code example here. And you can see it introduces this hook called useApplyDocumentActions, which gives us a function in which we can insert this function imported from the SDK. This one's going to be delete document, and once again is going to use one of those document handles. Then we're rendering a button which is going to handle that delete action. We'll need to put this into our feedback edit component. And I'm going to wrap this one in a Flex container as well, because we'll add some more buttons later on. Now, if I open up a document, we can see there's a new delete button here. And if I click delete on this, we'll see it disappears immediately from the right-hand side, and then shortly after is removed from the left. So there we see a small example of that optimistic versus eventual changes in the SDK, depending on which hooks that you're using. There are occasions where we don't actually want to invoke a draft. We want to make a change to a document and publish it straight away. And this sort of custom action is something that's very simple to make in the Sanity App SDK. Here, we're using the useEditDocument hook and the useApplyDocumentActions to create functions that will do both at the same time. Here, a function for handling mark as spam. We're going to edit the status field of the document and then apply the publish document action. So here on this clear bit of spam, we can click our mark as spam option, and that immediately writes a value against the document and then publishes that draft, so it's committed immediately. And your mind might now be racing at all of the opportunities that the edit document function gives you. You could now take actions in bulk or have logic-driven document changes in a custom application to make the thing that you need to do all of the time much faster. Behind the scenes of the App SDK, many events are being emitted when documents change or get published, and we can give feedback to our users when these things happen by monitoring events as they occur in the App SDK through yet another React hook. Popping up toast notifications is a really handy way to add some extra information to our application, and we can see here within this Sanity UI component, we have not only the theme provider from Sanity UI, but a toast provider in order to pop toast notifications. Now I can create a new component called feedback events, which is going to use the hook useDocumentEvent, which will run a handler where we can monitor what event types have happened, such as document publish or document delete, and fire toast notifications to confirm to the user what's just happened. So for example, if we say this one here is positive and approved, then we've now published those changes and the user is let know. Or at least they would be if I queued up that document. Let's go and have a look at how this works. Yes, feedback events needs to go there. Thank you. I do like to leave in a few of my own mistakes. I'd hate to have you think that I'm perfect. Well, let's get rid of that example component here too. Let's try again. Approve the document. No? Come on. What's happening here? Let's approve that one. There we go. All right, so perhaps this one was already published and that's why that approval didn't happen. That makes sense. And let's try and delete this one as well, just to make sure that the delete action happens. There we go. Feedback was deleted. So there we go. It's quite simple once you enqueue your components to monitor events, to be able to provide alerts, or maybe other logic takes place when actions occur. All of these things you can monitor in your application. On a large enough content team, something that becomes critical is who is responsible for something. And fortunately, we can look at the users that are across a Sanity project and turn those into data to create a user assignment of sorts on documents. And that's what we'll do with this useUsers hook. Let's create a new component. We'll call this one assignee. And what this one is going to do is use our useUsers hook from the React SDK, and then use the edit document here to write the value of the user's ID to the path assignee in the document. Now, if we go back to our feedback edit form and add our assignee field there, we can now open up any of these documents, and we can see here that sadly in this project, I'm the only person here, but I can assign it to myself, so I'll take responsibility for this feedback. We can see it not only uses my user ID, but it has information like my avatar. So now I can assign myself to documents. What would be really great is to be able to filter this list of documents on the left to only see what I'm responsible for. Let's fix that next. Currently, our list of documents is only filtered by what type they are, but we can apply more grok filtering to this documents list to get a more fine-grained response from this hook. Let's go and set this up now. First, I'm going to create a new component here called status selector. And then another component to toggle whether we only see my responsibilities. This component uses the use current user hook, so it's always updated for whoever is the currently logged in user. The status selector simply maintains a list of state for what status value the document has. What we need now is to go and update our feedback list with both of those new components, and then to monitor this state in our application and pass those variables into our grok filter. Now, this is a lot to look at, admittedly. I'll try my best to step through how this works. So on the right-hand side, we have these different status selectors. These are just React state in the application. And it's updating a state string to say, well, my status, I only want to look at pending style documents, or I only want to look at spam documents. Well, if we've set this status value to spam, then we're going to update this parameter status to spam. And this select function here within our grok filter is going to look at, well, which one of these is true first? Does status equal pending? No. Does status equal spam? Yes. So in this instance, the status state here in React is spam. So it's updated the filter to only look for documents where the status field equals spam. And that's why we only have this one document here. The other select function is saying if the user ID is defined, then filter where the assignee field is only on user ID. So here I can say, let's just look for mine. And here's that document that I assigned myself to earlier. So we've now combined a little React state management with our grok filters to create a much more dynamic application, and one that's more user-friendly to the specific user who's logged in and using it. Our application is separated away from the Sanity Studio, and that can be a good thing. And the Sanity dashboard gives us a way to be able to click between our application and the studio, and that's also a very good thing. But sometimes it might be more useful to have a direct relationship from one document in our application back to the Sanity Studio if work needs to continue there. And fortunately, there's one hook with a very long name that gives us that functionality. Before we set up that hook, we'll need to deploy the studio. So from our studio directory, we run npx sanity deploy. And we can create a new host name if we don't have one already. And we can say this one is the feedback course. You'll need to come up with something unique there. And we now have a URL for our host. We can add this to our Sanity CLI file in the studio directory. And now back in our feedback application, let's create yet another new component. This one is called Open in Studio. And we'll paste in the code example. Before going too much further, I'd like to point out a difference in the way that this component is composed. Here, we're actually exporting the suspense boundary itself instead of wrapping this component in a suspense boundary where it's invoked. And the reason why is because I like this pattern of co-locating the loading state and the eventual child being rendered in the one component. Here, when loading, this is the fallback that will render, and this child component is what will load when the document has finished loading. Our loading state and our final state are both buttons that share the same text prop. One is disabled and one is not. This avoids layout shift, and layout shift is an incredibly important consideration, especially when working with a real-time application. Documents may change, they may get edited, they may get removed, they may get added, and we need to be able to build an application that handles this without things flying everywhere as they load into view. So now we have this button. Let's go back to our feedback edit component. And I'm going to drop this in where our action buttons are. We do need to give that our handle, and I'm just going to change the way that this flexbox works because space between is a bit better there. Oh, we have some overflow. Let's change this to be column reverse for one more size there. All right, that's better. And actually, let's go and add that as it was before. Just handling the responsive design section of this because my app is quite small on the right-hand side while I'm making this video. And now when I click Open in Studio, I'm sent directly to that studio, right into the document that I was editing in my own application. So far, everything we've done is with React hooks from the App SDK, but we still have access to the raw Sanity client when we want to use something that hasn't yet been turned into a hook, such as our brand new AI agent actions. Let's take a look at that here. Before we use agent actions, we will need to deploy our schemas. So here within the studio folder, I'm going to run npx sanity schema list. And we should see that we have only one schema exported, and this took place when we deployed the studio in the previous lesson. If we open up any of these feedback documents, we'll see that our sentiment selector is a radio button here that requires a human to read and analyze this text. This is not the job of a human in 2025. We can do better. Let's open up our sentiment component here and replace it with something much more complex. And that is something that is going to use that schema ID that we just saw in the previous command line tool. And now our sentiment component grabs the Sanity client and uses the experimental API version for good measure. This may be stable by the time you're watching this video. And here we can generate via an agent action an edit to a document, and that is using the handle that's passed in. We've given it a prompt telling it how helpful it is and that the content that we're passing it will need to be assessed for either positive, neutrality, or negative sentiment. We need to pass it the value of this content from the feedback document, and it's going to read the schema ID so that it knows what paths to write edits to. We can then pop those toast notifications on the success or error of this function. Now, before I click this assess button over here, I know that I need to go back to the feedback edit component here, and our sentiment component's types were updated because it will need the value of that feedback. And now if I click this assess button, let's go and choose one that hasn't been scored yet. We can see the AI agent has assessed that this is neutral. This one's positive. And there's not enough negative feedback here to try out. So you now see that you have access to Sanity Client at any moment where you want to do something that's not exposed to you via a React hook, such as our AI agent actions. Just like we deployed our studio, we can now deploy our application so it's available to us in the dashboard. From the command line, let's get out of the studio directory and back into our app directory and run npx sanity deploy. We can give our application a title, and it will ask us to add this ID value to the Sanity CLI file inside of the app directory. And if we reload our dashboard here on the right-hand side, we can see the local application in development alongside of our deployed feedback application. There is another small quality of life update that I'd like to make in the application before we finish, and that's around using suspense. If we have a look at our feedback component, as we select different documents, we do see the loading spinner for a moment between documents. Now, these document values get cached eventually, and so they don't always show a loading spinner, but they do often enough for it to be annoying. Fortunately, suspense gives us a function to maintain the current state while it waits for the next state to load in, instead of always rendering the fallback, in this case, a spinner. It's called start transition, and we can drop it right here beneath this use state. We'll need to import the start transition function. And so instead of just setting the new state value when a button is clicked, we're going to do this inside of the start transition function. And this means instead of seeing the loading spinner every time we click a document, we only ever see the last document until the next document is ready to load. There's a lot I could say about suspense and real-time applications and layout shift. I've touched on a few things in this course, but it probably deserves its own video. Check out documentation for more. There's great examples on what you can do with suspense loading in single-page applications. And finally, there was that other thing that I mentioned where the left-hand list isn't optimistic like the right. For example, if I approve this document, you'll see it reflect immediately in the top right because we're using useDocument, but it takes a little moment to update here in the list to the left-hand side. Since we're trying to use useDocument sparingly, it makes sense if we use it for the selected document in the list and not any of the other documents. So let's set up a second document preview component with the exact same layout, but using the optimistic useDocument hook. Here we'll create another component called feedback preview selected. And we can see that this file is going to share a lot of similarities with our feedback preview, but it uses the useDocument hook instead of the useDocumentProjection to get the same values. And now back in our feedback list, we can selectively choose which one of these preview components to render. The selected one will get the fast and optimistic preview selected. The other will get the slower preview projection. And so now we should be able to click on any document, make a change, and see it reflected immediately in both locations without any impact to the memory or performance of the application. And that's it. Now you've got a custom content application that's purpose-built for a specific type of content operation. And this is really just scratching the surface on everything App SDK. I'm sure you can think of greater examples and more complex use cases, and we'd love to see them. Join our Discord community and share what you've made. We can't wait to see it.